My name is David Cooper. I am Tippie and Rollins Professor of Economics at the Tippie College of Business, and I'm also the Departmental Executive Officer for Economics. And today I'm going to tell you something about experimental economics, how understanding humans helps us understand economics. So the first question you might be asking is, you're about to listen to a presentation on experimental economics, so what is economics? And to understand the answer to that question, you first have to understand something about how economists traditionally have thought about decision-making by people. Normally, economists have assumed that people are very rational, meaning that they don't make any mistakes when they make decisions, and meaning that they use all available information. And they've also typically assumed that people have a very stylized form of preferences. In particularly, they assume that people are very self-interested. Oftentimes, economists assume that all people care about is making as much money as possible. You'll sometimes hear the term homo economicus. It's kind of a joke. The idea is that human beings, as modeled by economists, aren't really humans, homo sapiens. They're this other version of human being, homo economicus. Well, you don't have to have had a lot of contact with real people to begin to doubt these strong assumptions. If you think about yourself, if you think about other people you know, there are probably many times where you or others have made mistakes, where you haven't used all the available information, where you cared about something other than just what was good for you. And it's not just thinking about our own lives. There's ample evidence from psychology that makes us question all of these assumptions. That insight led to the rise of a new field, behavioral economics. And this has been going on now for quite some time. Behavioral economics is probably more than 40 years old at this point in time. The idea is to take insights from economics, insights from psychology, and combine them. The goal is to have more realistic models and more realistic insights into what is likely to happen in economic situations. Experimental economics is just a subfield within behavioral economics. If you're going to talk about, well, what do people do in real life? How do they actually make some decisions? You need evidence. Where does the evidence come from? A lot of it comes from controlled experiments. And that's what experimental economists do. We run controlled experiments. We study how individuals or groups of individuals actually make choices. It's not a coincidence that as an experimental economist, I'm working at the University of Iowa. The Department of Economics at the University of Iowa is actually the site of much of the pioneering work in experimental economics. People like Bob Forsyth, Doug DeYoung, Joyce Berg are some of the pioneers of this field. For me, I've been at Iowa for a year. One of the big attractions of coming to the University of Iowa and coming to the Tippie College of Business was the possibility of continuing on that strong tradition. So, as an economist, what can I learn from experiments? Well, I talked about this strong assumption that people are always rational. What are the implications of people not being rational? And to think about a specific setting, think about financial bubbles. So normally in a financial market or in markets in general, we think that the price, the value of a good or a security tracks its underlying value. So stocks get their value from the flow of dividends that are generated by that stock. But there are times where we see the price for a security or for some other good wildly diverge from what we think it is actually worth. We see this explosive growth in prices, usually followed, unfortunately, by a crash. Can we use experiments looking at why people are maybe not fully rational to understand why those bubbles are taking place? And we'd like to understand because we'd like to be able to prevent them or at least to better survive them. Another one, there are a lot of situations where actually economic theory isn't as useful as we would like because it doesn't make any clear prediction. Can we use experimental data to make clear predictions in settings where the traditional theory is mute? And as an example here, I'm going to be thinking about leadership. There are many situations which economists classify as coordination games. In these games, the theory predicts that people will coordinate on something, but they could coordinate on many things. There's a lot of interest. Can we get them to coordinate on the thing which is collectively the best? How might you get there? Well, one mechanism that's been proposed is leadership. The theory doesn't really speak to how leadership might help. So we've used experiments to understand how leadership might be useful. So I'm going to start with the first topic, thinking about the implications of rationality. And to help think about this, we're not actually going to play this game. I just want you to stop, I pause the recording for a second and think about it. We're going to think about a fairly simple game. So think about picking a number between 0 and 100. If you wanted to, you could use decimals. So if for some reason 64.83 was your lucky number, you could choose it. How do we figure out who wins the game? Well, we're going to pick the person who's closest to 1/2 the median, and they're going to win a prize. How do you figure out what the median is? We're going to order the numbers from the lowest to the highest. The numbers that's exactly in the middle of that ordering is the median. And if there's an even number of participants, we take the average of the two middle numbers. So for example, suppose the numbers submitted were 155, 377, 898, and 905. That couldn't possibly happen. You're told numbers have to be between 0 and 100. But suppose it was, well, the middle number there, the third out of 5, is 377. So the median is 377. A second example, suppose the numbers were 472, 555, 602, 662, 788, and 934. The middle two numbers are 602 and 662. Taking the average of those two numbers, well, the median would be 632. To win this game, you choose the number that you think will be closest to half of what the median is. So in the example here, if the median was 632, half the median would be 316. Now, it can't be that because the highest possible number is 100, but whoever was closest to 316 would win the prize. So I'm going to catch my breath here and take a drink of water. You can see a beautiful Iowa drinking mug here. Think for a second about what number you might pick if you were actually able to play this game. So the game that I just described is called the beauty contest game. And a little bit later in this webinar, we'll talk about why it's called the beauty contest game. But just to be clear, it does not have anything to do with actual beauty contest contestants like are shown here. The history of this game is actually a little bit interesting. It's a nice story. So the woman who invented this game was Rosemary Nagel. She actually called it the guessing game originally, but it's usually called the beauty contest game nowadays. When Rosie came up with this game, she was actually a graduate student. This was the lead paper in her PhD dissertation. Her advisor was a man named Reinhard Zelten. Now, you probably haven't heard of Reinhard Zelten, but he was one of the pioneers of game theory. You may have heard of John Nash. John Nash won the Nobel Prize for his pioneering work in game theory. One of the people who won it with John Nash was, in fact, Reinhard Zelten. So this is a really powerful, important person. Rosie was his student. Zelten hated this idea. He told her, terrible idea. You should not do this. You'll never get a job. You're going to fail if you try this idea. So what did Rosie do? Well, she really believed in her idea. She thought, this is a really great idea. I think this is really interesting. I think other people think it's interesting. And she went with her gut feeling. And even though this super powerful guy who was her advisor told her not to do it, she did it anyway. You know what? Incredibly successful work, very well known, made her entire career. What's the takeaway? Well, sometimes maybe when people are telling you that something is a bad idea, even with somebody who's really powerful and really successful, if you really believe in that idea, maybe you should just do it. It certainly worked for Rosie. Maybe it'll work for you as well. Anyways, she did it. We've got this. And it's the guessing game, or that's what she called it, or as we call it today, the beauty contest game. So our question is, what should a rational individual choose in the beauty contest game? And maybe a question that sounds a little funny to you, but won't in a second, hopefully, is how rational is it to act rationally? So to think about what an individual should do if they're rational, it helps to know a little bit of stuff from game theory. So I'm going to define a term weak dominance. So weak dominance, I should never choose a strategy if another strategy always does weakly better. What does that mean? So imagine you're in some strategic situation. We call any such strategic situation a game. You can imagine maybe two firms competing against each other could be a game, two countries' governments in some sort of strategic interaction. That's something we would model as a game. Within a game, you have a bunch of actions you can take. We call those strategies. So imagine you have strategy X and you have strategy Y. Suppose that no matter what the other person or people do, strategy X always does better or at least as well as strategy Y. Then we say strategy Y is weakly dominated. A very weak condition for rationality is that you should never play a strategy that's weakly dominated. Why would you? There's something else that always does better. Why would you choose Y if you know no matter what the other people do, you're going to always do at least as well, and in some cases better, by choosing X? So how does that apply to the beauty contest game? Well, let's start at the beginning. You can choose any number between 0 and 100. If you order the numbers from lowest to highest, the number in the middle is the median. Nobody can pick a number higher than 100, so the median can never be bigger than 100. But the median can never be bigger than 100. Half the median can never be bigger than 50. You want to be as close as possible to half the median. Picking 50 has to be closer than any number above 50 because half the median has to be 50 or below. So if you're not going to use weakly dominated strategies, you should never pick any number greater than 50. So get rid of all the numbers that are greater than 50. But we can go farther. If nobody's going to choose a number that's greater than 50 because they're rational, it means the numbers can only be from 0 to 50. It means the median can never be greater than 50, and half the median can never be greater than 25. Well, if that's true, I should get rid of all the numbers that are greater than 25. And I can keep doing that again and again and again. I can get rid of all the numbers that are greater than 12.5. I can get rid of all the numbers that are greater than 6.25. If I continue this process of elimination ad infinitum, the only number that's going to be left at the end is 0. So if everybody is rational, everybody should choose 0 in this game. Now, you might say, David, you talked about rationality and removing weakly dominated strategies, not using them, but it seems like you went a lot farther than that on that last slide. And you're right. So being just rational isn't enough. We also rely on something that game theorists call common knowledge of rationality. So think about the process I just went through. To get rid of all the numbers that were above 50, that only required me to be rational, that I wouldn't use something that was weakly dominated. But the second step, that required me to believe that other people were rational. So I had to believe everybody else was rational and get rid of the numbers above 50. That's what let me get rid of all the numbers above 25. And I could make the same argument again to get rid of the numbers above 12.5. I had to believe that everybody else believed that everybody was rational. I keep on doing this, adding and adding more layers to that. That's what we call common knowledge of rationality. And that's a key thing. It's not enough that I'm rational. To get to that solution of choosing 0, I have to also believe that other people are rational and that other people believe that other people are rational, and so on and so forth. If that's not true, I'm going to get something very different in terms of how people behave. And that's what we actually see. So this is data from Rosie's 1995 paper. And what she argued is that people won't do that. They're only going to go through a few levels of the reasoning process that I just described. The data supports that prediction. So if that prediction is right, you should see a lot of data around 50, a lot of data around 25, and a lot of data around 12.5, and maybe a few spikes lower. And that's exactly what you can see here. So here's a spike at 50. Here's a spike at 25. here's a little bit diffuse, but there's a big spike at 12.5. It's a little hard to see from this graph. It's a little easier. Whereas he took the data and basically put it into clusters around the breakpoints, but also including bins for things which are in between the breakpoints. And you can see it's not random. There's a big cluster at step 0, an even bigger cluster at step 1, and the biggest cluster is at step 2. What are some takeaways from this? Well, the first one is that being rational wouldn't be very rational here. So if you're rational, that argument was, well, you should go through an infinite number of rounds of this sort of reasoning process and you should choose 0. If you chose 0 in a beauty contest game, you would lose for certain. In fact, what's usually optimal is to go 2 rounds into this. So being rational doesn't necessarily get you to the right place. Being boundedly rational, only going a few rounds into this, is the right thing to do. And you can see, actually, not only is it the right thing to do, it's what most people tend to do. They go in about 2 steps. There are a lot of people who go in less, but this is sort of the sweet spot, going 2 steps in. It varies a little bit from population to population, but most populations, that's about the right part. One other really important point to take away from this: going 2 steps in doesn't mean that you're not capable of going farther. I've seen this game played where the people playing it were game theorists at a conference. They've all seen the game before. They all know what the, quote, rational solution will be. They still only go 2 or 3 steps into the process. Why? It's about that common knowledge of rationality idea. It's not that they can't figure it out. It's that they think other people won't figure it out, or that other people think that other people won't figure it out. That's enough to make it so you don't go all the way in. That's a really important insight from this experiment. It's not just about whether people are rational. It's also about whether people think other people are rational. And if they don't, it actually doesn't even matter whether there are any irrational people in the population. As long as people don't believe that others are rational, you'll see that they don't go to the fully rational solution, which in this case would be choosing 0. So why, as an economist, do I care about that? Well, this is a very famous and, from some points of view, kind of depressing graph. This is a graph from maybe the most famous financial bubble of them all. This is the 1929 stock crash. And remember, what do I mean by a bubble? Well, for a financial bubble, this is in the stock market. What we see is the price of something, stocks in this case, gets unmoored from the underlying value of those stocks. We'll see this sort of explosive upward phase. So you can see how prices were exploding here through the late 20s, and then a crash. So what's happening in this market? So a combination of things are driving this huge upwards explosion. There's lots of speculation. I'll talk about that more in a little bit. Lots of speculation in this market. There are lots of naive investors coming to this market. There is, to be honest, a fair amount of fraud going on in this market. There are also loose margin requirements. If you want to, you can buy stocks on margin. That means you borrow most of the money to buy your stock. That was unusually easy to do during this time period, but it also meant that there are a lot of owners of stock who are very vulnerable to price changes. If the price goes down and you've bought on margin, you need to come up with money to refill your margin account. And if you stretch yourself to your limits, that's going to cause a problem. And that's exactly what happens here. In the late summer and early fall of 1929, it becomes clearer and clearer that there's about to be a recession. Financial gravity begins to kick in, stock prices start to drift lower. You have all of these people who borrowed lots and lots of money to buy stocks. They all face what are called margin calls. They need to put additional money in because their stocks have lost value. They don't have that money. They're overextended. What do? They sell some of their stock in order to meet the margin calls. But if a lot of people are selling stock to meet their margin call, that's going to put downward pressure on the market. It snowballs and the market crashes. It culminates in Black Thursday, it's October 24th, 1929, and Black Tuesday, that's October 29th, 1929. Not a good week. The market lost about a quarter of its value in just a week. That is catastrophic. It's not true that the stock market crash caused the Great Depression. It was likely a contributing cause and was certainly a harbinger of what was to come. The Great Depression was probably the single worst event in US economic history. Having a bubble like this was a part of getting the Great Depression started. How does that relate to the guessing game or the beauty contest game that we've talked about? Well, there's this really nice quote from the New York Times from August of 1929. The present modus operandi in the market appears to be the buying of leading issues for the purpose of passing them on to someone else at a higher price. Think about that a little bit. So that's speculation. You're not buying the stock because you think it's actually worth a lot. You're buying it because you think somebody else will think it's worth a lot. That's the sort of idea that the beauty contest game is letting us get at. The idea it's not that I'm irrational. I don't actually need anybody in this market who's irrational, who really believes the stock is worth this incredible amount that it hit at the peak. What I need are people who believe that others are irrational and will believe that that stock is worth that much and will be willing to take it off their hands at a nice, tidy profit. So I'm old, but I'm not that old. I don't actually remember the stock market crash in 1929. This one I do remember, and probably many of you do as well. This is the crash that took place, the bubble and crash that took place in the market for tech stocks in the late 1990s. This was largely happening in NASDAQ. So you see the same pattern again. You see this explosive growth upwards in price. The prices are getting unmoored from any reality of what these stocks might be worth. And then in the early 2000s, you see this tremendous crash in that market. I remember going to an economics conference during this time. It was a small workshop, and as oftentimes happens at a small workshop, we're done with the day's talks. People are gathering outside to have some drinks. I was in upstate New York, so we were looking over the Hudson River, and people start talking about the stock market. It was really interesting. Everybody agreed this is obviously a bubble. It is obvious that prices have become unmoored from any reality for what these stocks are actually worth. So I remember asking people, so I guess you're not investing because this is obviously a bubble. I said, are you crazy? No, there are tremendous profits being made here. It's going to crash eventually, but you just have to sell before the crash takes place. They were working on the theory of the greater fool, that it's not that they were irrational, it's that they believed others were irrational and that they could take advantage of that and make money by trying to anticipate the irrationality of others. One last example. This is a famous one. If you've ever seen the movie The Big Short, which if you haven't, I recommend it. It's a nice movie, is all about this. There was famously a bubble in the housing market in the last 2000s. What happens once again, you see, it's a little hard to see on the screen, but prices for housing growing explosively in the late 2000s, driven by the same forces we oftentimes see in bubbles. Lots of speculation going on, lots of naive investors coming in, lots of borrowing was going on, especially in the Florida markets with little money down. There was a fair amount of fraud going on in this market. All the things that we typically see in bubbles are going on here. Flipping was very common during this point in time. That's a perfect example of speculation. Those are people buying houses, planning simply to resell them on at a higher price in a short period of time, maybe after making some renovations. It crashed, it set off the Great Recession. If you look over here, we've seen this goes through May of 2022. We've seen the same sort of explosive growth in house prices recently. It's begun to cool off quite a bit. Is this a bubble? It's too early to tell. We don't really know. It might not be. This may all be caused by the repercussions of the COVID pandemic, but it might be a bubble. If I showed you the graph of stock prices, you might look at that graph over the last couple of years and say, maybe that's a bubble too. Are we in the middle of a bubble? Is it going to cause a crash? Is it going to set off a recession the same way the crashes in 1929 and the housing crash in the late 2000s set off the Great Depression or the Great Recession? I don't know, but you have to be a little bit worried. All of these markets have that same feature that we've talked about multiple times. It's not about people being irrational. It's about the failure of what we call common knowledge of rationality. It's about the theory of the greater fool, that I'm buying stocks or houses knowing they're overvalued because I think there are other people who may not have figured it out, who may not be rational. I can sell it on to them. That brings me to a question from a while ago. Why do we call this thing the beauty contest game? Well, it's because of a quote from this guy. This is a picture of John Maynard Keynes, and he had this really nice quote comparing bubbles, or actually he was really talking about financial markets in general, but it's particularly true for bubbles, to a contest that used to be played in the British newspaper. So let me just read the quote to you. Professional investment may be likened to those newspaper competitions in which competitors have to pick out the 6 prettiest faces from 100 photographs, the prize being awarded to the competitor whose choice most nearly corresponds to the average preferences of the competitors as a whole. It is not a case of choosing those which, to the best of one's judgment, are really the prettiest, nor even those which average opinion genuinely thinks the prettiest. We have reached the 3rd degree where we devote our intelligences to anticipating what average opinion expects the average opinion to be. And there are some, I believe, who practice the 4th, 5th, and higher degrees. So what was this contest? This was back in the 1920s. To today's eyes, it frankly looks a little bit sexist, but you have to think it was literally a century ago. What they were showing you were a bunch of pictures, headshots of women, and what you're supposed to do is pick out which women were the most attractive. What is Keynes's point? Well, you win the prize if you can pick out the women who other people think are the most attractive. So you should not be trying to pick out the ones that you personally think are the prettiest. So suppose, for example, that I happen to think that, I don't know, maybe I think brunettes are the most attractive. Should I pick out pictures of people who are brunettes? Well, if I think that most people think that, in fact, blondes are the most attractive, even though I personally prefer brunettes, I should pick out pictures of people who are blondes. It might be that nobody actually thinks blondes are most attractive. But if everybody thinks that everybody else thinks that blondes are most attractive, we will all end up picking out blondes. And that was Keynes's point about the stock market. Stock market, you make a lot of your profit through capital gains. That means you sell it for more than you bought it for. What are you trying to do? You're trying to pick out the stocks that other people will think are valuable. You might not think personally that that stock is so valuable. That doesn't matter. If you think that other people think it's going to be valuable, it's still worth having because you can sell it to them. A financial bubble is just a pathological version of this. It's where the prices become unmoored and everybody's, in some sense, the market is chasing its tail. They're chasing after these speculative gains because everybody thinks that I can buy the stock and sell it on a higher price. Doesn't actually need anybody who's irrational, although usually you do have a core group of people who don't understand that they're in a bubble. But all it really needs is this idea, and much of what drives it is this idea of, I believe that other people are irrational. And so instead of getting out of this market, and ask, why don't all the rational people short the market and push the prices down? Well, if they believe that the other people are irrational, they're going to come in, they're going to buy stocks because they believe that other people don't get it. And they're going to be able to sell that stock on for a nice fat profit. They're going to be able to sell that house on and flip it for a nice fat profit. So a lot of experiments, the experiment I showed you was for the guessing or beauty contest game, but a lot of experiments have been run looking directly at financial markets, small sort of experimental ones being run in a laboratory, and looking at bubbles. What sorts of things have we learned about bubbles beyond this basic insight that they're driven by not just a failure of rationality, but maybe more so a failure of the common knowledge of rationality? Well, you might say, well, you're running experiments on students, but surely financial professionals, people who they do this for a living would get it. You wouldn't get the bubbles. Not true. If you run these experiments using financial professionals, bubbles are just as common as they are with students. And that makes sense once you get this idea of it's all about a failure of common knowledge of rationality. Even if you're a really expert financial trader, if you believe the other people in the market don't get that they're in a bubble, you're still going to want to trade. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Everybody thinks that everybody else is irrational, and collectively they act irrationally, even if nobody is in fact irrational. Now, it is true in both cases, students or financial professionals, with experience, you get fewer bubbles. Once you've lived through one of these things and seen how badly it turned out, you're not so eager to buy into it. Maybe you begin to think the other people aren't quite so dumb, and maybe I'm overestimating my ability to time this and get out at the correct time. Having said that, it's not surprising to learn that bubbles are more likely when traders are overconfident. In fact, it makes perfect sense. If I think I'm super smart and more rational than everybody else, I become more willing to buy into a bubble because I'm confident, in fact, overconfident, that I will time it correctly and get out before the market crashes. Bubbles are less likely if traders are given information, increasing their belief in the rationality of other traders. Once again, makes perfect sense. If what drives a lot of the bubble is the idea that I believe that others are irrational and I can in some sense outsmart them and outsmart the market, if I know they're not as irrational as I thought, I believe that less, and it's less likely that a bubble is going to form. And finally, one that doesn't obviously have to do with common knowledge or rationality, but you can decide for yourself what it means. It turns out that if you run a market with all men and compare it with a market with all women, bubbles are less frequent with female traders than with male traders. I don't know what you want to make of that, but I think it's an interesting fact. Finally, one last insight on bubbles. These are the reputed last words of John Maynard Keynes. It's not clear if they really were, but it is clear that he said something like this at some point in his life. I'd like to believe these were his last words. My only regret in life is that I did not drink more champagne. So if you want to learn something from John Maynard Keynes about bubbles, well, maybe you can think about that. So that was the first thing I wanted to talk about in this webinar. The second thing is this idea that there's situations where standard theory, economic theory, game theory doesn't do a good job predicting what's going to happen. We can use experiments to better understand what's going to happen and maybe to get some insight into how to better design institutions or how to better manage a situation. So the game that's being shown here is called the weak link game. And in a few moments, I'll make it clear why that would be. Once again, this is not going to be played, but I'd like you to think about it. So imagine that you're playing the game shown above in a group of 5 people. Each person is simultaneously going to choose an effort level. They can choose either low, medium, or high. The payoff is going to be determined by what they choose and the lowest effort level chosen by anybody else in their group. So your choice determines the row, low, middle, or high. The lowest choice by the other people in your group, the other 4, low, middle, or high, determines the column. Whatever effort level would you choose? And a slightly different question. Suppose before you played the game, you could just sit at your computer and type in a text message and send it to the other members of your group. What would you want to say to them? So let's think a little bit about this game. What are the trade-offs in this game? So if you look at this game, the largest possible payoff is here at 250. It gets the highest possible payoffs if everyone chooses it, but it's also risky. Remember, this is the lowest choice, not by one person, it's by the 4 other people in your group. If any of those 4 people choose low, you're going to get 0. Now, think about choosing low. It doesn't matter what anybody else does. If everybody chooses low, you get 200. If nobody chooses low, you still get 200. You get 200 no matter what. So there's this trade-off between looking at trying to get the highest payoff, which is kind of risky, or going for the safe thing and getting a pretty good payoff, a little bit lower, but it's very safe. There is not an obviously rational thing to do in this game. In technical terms, this game has multiple Nash equilibria. You may recognize that name. If you ever wondered what John Nash won the Nobel Prize for, it's for this idea of Nash equilibrium. I don't need to go into the technical details, but thinking about this particular game, suppose I'm thinking about high. If everybody is choosing high, I also want to choose high. So it's an equilibrium in the sense that if I expect everybody else to do it, I want to do it as well. But the same is true for middle. If everybody else is choosing middle, I want to choose middle. If I chose high, I wouldn't do any better. If I chose high, I would do worse. If I chose middle, if I chose low, I would do a little bit worse. If everybody else is choosing low, best thing for me to do is choose low. So standard technical tools for what a rational person should do in this game don't give you any guidance. Now think about that second question. What should you say to people? Well, as a leader, you'd like everybody to choose high. Is that enough? Because remember, choosing high is risky. Does it work just to tell people choose high? Is there something else maybe you ought to do? You can think about all sorts of things that you might want to try. So that brings me to the question of leadership. What does it mean to lead in an organizational setting? Can we answer why some leaders are effective and some are not? So there are lots of things that leaders might do. So leaders oftentimes lead by example. If you think about the weak link game I just showed you, you might lead by choosing high if other people could see what you're doing, but everybody here chooses simultaneously. They can't see what you're doing. You can't lead by example. You might lead due to superior information. Sometimes the person who's the leader, they're the leader because they know something that others don't. That's not relevant here. There isn't anything to know in the weak link game. Leading in persuasion, though, makes a lot of sense. And we know that some people are better than others at that. So let's think about two real-life leaders. This is Winston Churchill. I think everybody would agree that Winston Churchill was a fairly effective leader. So here's a quote from Winston Churchill from the start of World War II. I have myself full confidence that if all do their duty, if nothing is neglected, and if the best arrangements are made as they are being made, we shall prove ourselves once more able to defend our island home. So, famous speech by Winston Churchill. He was a really effective leader. He got people to work together, and he was able to achieve success. Not all leaders in similar dire straits are so successful. This is Saddam Hussein. This is a quote from the beginning of the Gulf War. Fight them because with their defeat, you will be at the last entrance of the conquest of all conquests. The war will end with dignity, glory, and triumph for your people, army, and nation. Saddam Hussein didn't work out quite as well for him. So why are some people able to successfully lead, others are not? We can use experiments to try to answer that question. So why did I call that game the weak link game? Because we're not just interested in it as an abstract little game that we can play in a webinar or in a laboratory. We think it has a lot to say about situations that people face in real world settings. So this is a cartoon by Dilbert, or from Dilbert. This is Wally, who's one of the main characters in the cartoons. He's sort of a ne'er-do-well. He's at a meeting about a group project, and a woman asks him, and Wally, did you finish your project task for today? And he says, no, I took a calculated risk that other people would not finish their task either, making my lateness totally irrelevant. She starts to chew him out. That is the worst. Then two other people pipe in, I need another week. So there are lots of settings within organizations, firms, universities where I work, all sorts of places where you get coordination failure. You get trapped in a bad outcome and it can be caused by a single weak link. So in this cartoon, Wally is a weak link. And the tricky thing is that you don't actually need anybody who's badly intended. If people think that other people won't do their part, it makes sense to not do their part either. So think about starting a meeting. You'd like to start on time, but it's sort of a pain to be there on time, and you're wasting time if you think other people will be late. If you think that there's somebody else in the meeting who'll be 15 minutes late, well, you should be late too. But if everybody thinks that somebody else will be 15 minutes late, everybody shows up 15 minutes late, that's an example of coordination failure, where it just needs one person being late if you can't start the meeting until everybody is there to cause a failure. But if everybody thinks that everybody else is going to be late, you get into this trap where no one person can get out. If you're working on a group project and everybody needs to do their part, if you think other people are going to be late on getting their parts done, there's no reason to hurry yourself, and becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. In such cases, getting out of the trap is not enough for any one person to improve. So if Wally here had been on time, it still wouldn't have worked because these other two people had also delayed, because like Wally, they reasoned that other people were going to be late and there was no point in hurrying. To get change to work here, you need coordinated change. Persuasion by leader could possibly be the mechanism that allows you to achieve the coordinated change that's necessary to overcome this. We call this a coordination trap. So that brings me to a specific set of lab experiments. The first set of experiments I talked about were not by me, but this one actually is by me. This is Brands and Cooper, 2007. Cooper is me. Brands is Jordi Brands, who is my Barcelona co-author. If you look here behind me, you can actually see an FC Barcelona flag. Because of Jordi, I've spent more than a little bit of time in Barcelona. And if you spend time in Barcelona, you inevitably end up rooting for FC Barcelona, and I do. So what is the turnaround game? A series of games, we refer to them as rounds, are going to be played by fixed 5-person groups consisting of a firm manager and 4 people who are in the role of employees. Each round starts with the manager choosing a bonus rate. We call that B. What is that bonus rate going to do? It's going to determine how much of the firm's revenue is transferred to the 4 employees. So it's a form of pay for the employees, and it's coming out of the money being earned by the firm manager. Employees are going to observe the value of B. Then they're going to simultaneously choose effort levels in 10-hour increments. So 0, 10, 20, 30, or 40. In terms of how this was framed for people in the experiment, we told them you're working, you have a 40-hour work week, and you're essentially choosing how many hours you're going to work hard. We didn't describe it exactly that way, but it's pretty close. So you could say, I'm going to work 20 hours really hard on the firm, and 20 hours I'm just going to be drinking coffee with my buddies and hanging out. How did payoffs work? Well, this kind of complicated looking formula determined what your payoff was as an employee. I'm not going to go through the details, but just 2 basic things that I want you to know. The first thing is that there is a cost of exerting effort. The more effort you put in, the harder you work, the more it costs you. And importantly, you pay that cost of effort whether or not other people work hard. So it might be that your group fails, but if you put in a lot of effort, you still bear the cost of that effort. The other thing is you get a bonus. That bonus is determined by the group's productivity, and that in turn is determined by the smallest effort, the lowest effort chosen by any person. So if there's one weak link, one person who chooses 0, nobody's going to get any bonus. The manager's payoff, here's the formula down here. What's important there? Well, productivity of the firm is determined by the minimum effort chosen by the 4 employees. That's going to generate some revenue for the manager, but they have to give up some of that to be able to pay the bonus. That creates a tension. If you think paying your employees well is going to make them particularly likely to want to coordinate at a high level of effort, you want a high B, but that means you're sending most of the revenue to your workers. So you sort of want this balance between high enough bonus that they work hard, but not so high that I don't make any money. So for all the bonus rates that are available in this game, you're going to end up with a weak link game. So these are the payoff tables for the lowest possible bonus rate that you could use and the highest possible bonus rate. This is a different version of the weak link game than the one I showed you a few slides ago, but it has the same basic property. For the same reason it was true before, everybody choosing the same effort level is going to be in Nash equilibrium. So I can't tell you that rationally there is a right thing for the 4 employees to do. As I change the bonus rate, it changes the employees' incentives. Now, it's still always going to be true that coordinating any of these effort levels is going to be rational in the sense of being in a Nash equilibrium, but it does change your incentive to try to move to a higher effort level. So in particular, suppose you start out, everybody's choosing 0. You say, it'd be great if we could go up by 1 level. Well, I'm going to choose 10. That costs me 50 here, given the numbers that are chosen for the experiment, but I only gain 10 if it works out. So I'm risking 50 to gain 10. That's not sounding so attractive. With the high bonus rate, I make it more attractive to coordinate at high effort levels. If I go up 1 level, still cost me 50, but I might gain 90. So I'm now risking 50 to gain 90. Sounds like it would be a lot more attractive to try to do that. So changing the bonus rate changes the incentives to coordinate for the employees, but remember, it's the manager who has to pay that. It's costly for them to have a higher bonus rate. So there we go. How does the experiment actually work? It's going to be played in 2 blocks. The first one is 10 rounds. The second one is 20 rounds. In the first block, the manager actually doesn't get to do anything. Everything is controlled by a computer taking the role of the manager. They're going to set a really low bonus rate. The whole point is we want to study what it takes to overcome coordination failure, to get out of a coordination trap. So we start by generating a history of coordination failure. At that point in time, that 5th person takes over and the human is now in control. One of the things they're always going to be able to do is they're going to control that bonus rate. So now as a manager, you face that question, how high do I want to set the bonus? Knowing that the higher I set the bonus, maybe the more my employees will work, but also the more money I'm going to have to give to them. How can I act as a leader? Well, I have the opportunity to communicate. So no communication, one-way communication. Before my employees make a decision in each round, I get to type a message and send it to them as a manager. 2-way communication, managers still send messages to employees. The employees get to send messages back. When they're making their decisions, they also type in text messages. No messages between the employees, just messages going back to the managers. So does having a leader matter? Does having more communication matter? The answer is yes. So the blue line here is a treatment with no communication. You can see not much happens. Being able to control the bonus rate does a little bit, but not much. The red line is one-way communication, distinctly higher effort levels, distinctly more productivity. So having the manager able to lead by sending messages, you do better. 2-way communication, the employees can respond better yet again. So having a leader who can maybe persuade people to coordinate is helpful. Having 2-way communication, more helpful yet. So one of the nice things about running an experiment is we not only can answer the question of does having a leader help? The answer is yes. But maybe more interestingly, we can look into why it helps because we can capture all of their messages and see what they sent. So that's what we did. We coded categories for every sort of message we observed. I'm not going to go through all of these. People said lots and lots of different things. I want to focus on just a few messages that turn out to be important. One thing that's sort of an obvious thing to do is to ask for effort, particularly to ask for a specific effort level. Payoffs are maximized if everybody chooses 40, the highest possible effort level. So maybe you should ask for the highest possible effort level. A second thing that people do a lot and turns out to matter quite a lot here is discussing the monetary benefits of high effort. What's particularly valuable is discussing mutual benefits. So discussing the monetary benefits of high effort. If you choose a higher effort, you'll make more money. Mutual benefits is a little bit different. If we all choose high effort, we will all make more money. Finally, the last one that I'm going to point out is emphasizing the bonus. That's literally just saying, I just chose B, it's going to be 12 this round. It's really hard to see why this should matter because the computer interface shows you in gigantic font what bonus rate was just chosen by the manager. Why do they need to say it in their message? Well, implicitly, what's being said when I emphasize the bonus is always that I am treating you well, I am paying you well. Do these things matter? Well, it turns out that we can look at what successful leaders say versus unsuccessful leaders, and there are systematic differences. So how do I say who's successful or unsuccessful? I'm going to just split up the groups by earnings. People who are above the median, so above average earners, are my successful leaders. People who are below the median, those are my unsuccessful leaders. Those are my good leaders versus my bad leaders. So does it matter how much you pay them? Not really. I'm going to focus on the first few rounds here. That's when you get a lot of action going on. After that, groups get coordinated and they just sort of lock in. If you look at the difference, there's not much. It turns out there's not really a very strong relationship between paying more and being successful. So what does help? Category 1, particularly category 1C. What was that? That was asking for an effort level, particularly a specific effort level. If you ask people to choose the highest possible effort, that turns out to be something that's done a lot more by your successful leaders than your unsuccessful leaders. Category 4, particular category 4C, which I don't show on this table, talking about benefits, particularly talking about the mutual benefits of choosing higher effort. Successful leaders, almost twice as likely to do that. Finally, this category where I just emphasize that I am paying you well. Unsuccessful leaders almost never did it. Successful leaders, quite frequent. So it looks like there are distinct differences in the patterns of communication between successful and unsuccessful leaders. What we should care about ultimately is the bottom line. Did they make more money by doing these things? And just to give you sort of a ballpark idea of whether an effect is big or not, the average profit per round for a leader was about a little bit more than 300. It gives you a sense of whether an effect is big or small. So increasing the bonus, it turns out it actually does lead to higher effort, but you also have to pay more as a manager. The effect of increasing the bonus was actually slightly negative, not much, but there was a small negative effect from increasing the bonus. There's no real benefit to paying people more. What about asking for higher effort, in particular, asking for the highest possible effort? Big positive effect. Since the average is only about 300, an increase of over 100 is really good. What about discussing the monetary benefits of high effort? Another big positive effect. If I had focused here on stressing mutual benefit, that effect would be even bigger. Emphasizing the bonus. That's particularly about this idea that I'm implicitly communicating that I'm paying you well. That works out really well. So it's a fairly simple communication strategy. That's one of the nice things about the experiment. We can look at what people said. We can give you some advice. Here are some simple things that seem to work. You can also say, there are lots of other things that people tried that didn't seem to work very well. Either you don't need to worry about them. So people give their workers praise all the time. It actually has a rather small effect. Doesn't really matter very much. Some things actually have negative effects. So some people laid out fairly complicated plans for, I'm going to change the bonus this way, and then you're going to do that, and then we're going to do this, and blah, blah, blah. Turns out that actually has a negative effect. We can give you a fairly concrete idea of if you're in this sort of situation, if you're facing something that looks like a coordination trap in the real world, and they happen in organizations all the time, here's something that seems to work pretty well. Turns out to be something pretty simple. We can identify that from the lab. You might ask, why is two-way communication so beneficial? That comes down to giving the manager advice. There are a lot of managers who don't do a good job. they don't send any messages, or if they do send messages, they're not particularly useful ones. You might have an employee who has a good idea about something the manager might do. The single best thing that they can do, it's not the most common thing they do, but it's the single best thing they can do is give the manager advice. Almost always, in fact, useful advice was send more messages, ask people to choose 40. So what should a manager do in a situation like this? The most important thing is talk. There are managers who didn't talk. The guys who don't send messages, they don't do real well. Can we say more? Yeah, it turns out there's this fairly simple strategy that works really well. Ask specifically for a higher effort level. Don't be vague. Tell people what they ought to do. Point out the mutual benefits of coordinating at a higher effort level. So it's not enough just to say, well, that you'll do better if you work harder. What you want to say is, we'll do better if we all work harder. And finally, stress that you're paying people generously. There's a subtlety here. You don't actually need to pay them generously. If you remember, it wasn't particularly profitable to do so, but you need to have people believe that they're being paid generously. What's the overall takeaway? It's not what you, it's what you say, not what you pay. What should an employee do? Talk, give the manager advice. Managers oftentimes freeze in the headlight. There's no real reason. Maybe I shouldn't say that as somebody who chairs a department, but there's no real reason to think that just because somebody is the manager, they're always going to be the person who has the best ideas. Pass on good ideas. Oftentimes that'll help the manager do a better job. Overall takeaways. What can we learn from experiments? Well, at a somewhat narrow level, what are the implications of individuals not always being fully rational? I spent a lot of time talking about market bubbles. It's sort of obvious that, well, irrationality must have something to do with that. And if just we didn't have irrational people, we wouldn't have bubbles. What's maybe not so obvious is that's not quite enough, because bubbles are at least as much about people who anticipate other people's irrational behavior. Just like the guessing game, it's not about people not being able to figure out that they should choose zero. It's as much or more about them not believing that other people will choose zero. It's about the theory of the greater fool. Once you understand that, you begin to get a much better sense of what sort of things will drive a bubble. And maybe it helps you think about it as well. So maybe we're in a housing bubble right now. Maybe we're in a financial bubble right now. Is it true that you're going to be able to outguess the other people in that market? People tend to think that they can, but it's not so easy to do. And maybe you should step back and say, maybe it's not that they're irrational people and that I'm the smart person in the room. Maybe everybody's trying to guess how rational everybody else is. Maybe I should be a little less confident that I'm going to be successful at doing that. The second set of experiments, can we make useful predictions in settings where traditional economic theory is mute? So coordinating people's actions can be difficult. There are lots of possible outcomes which are consistent with rationality. Looking at experiments can help us understand how you can overcome coordination failure. And if you want to think about this as sort of like economic engineering, I can give you advice on specific strategies they can use that work. In particular, the experiments we just talked about, it's a surprisingly simple communication strategy, turns out to be quite effective. So we ran those experiments using not college students, but subsequently we ran them using executive MBAs. These are very experienced business managers. They tried lots of stuff too, including stuff that the students didn't try. But it turned out not to matter. The same simple communication strategy worked for the EMBA students as worked for the undergraduates. So by looking at what people do and looking at what actually happens, we can identify things that might help you in the real world. That a really simple communication strategy turns out to be quite effective in these settings. And what's the overarching message to take away? Economics is really powerful. Obviously, I'm a fan. I chose to become an economist, but it can be hampered by really strong assumptions about what people do. We can learn a lot if we study what people actually do, rather than assuming that they're going to do what economists think they ought to do. We can get real insights by bringing in some psychology, by bringing in some evidence, and we can learn something that helps us better predict what's actually going to happen and lets us give better advice on what people ought to do. I hope that you found this webinar interesting and useful. If you'd like to ask any questions, feel free to contact me. I've put my email address down here at the bottom. Thank you for participating, and I look forward to telling you a little bit about the sort of work being done at the Tippie College of Business and at the University of Iowa. Thank you. And if you're still there, Ashley, I am done.